Welcome to the Circle of Life Coalition's morning programs we present monthly to educate the community related to all things surrounding life quality and end of life. Our vision is an informed community open to honest conversations about life and death, one in which we inspire each other to live life fully while acknowledging the inevitability of death, and where choices for end-of-life care are effectively communicated, documented, respected, and honored. We always want this to be a safe place for questions and education. Before I get on to our speakers and our great presentation today, I want to thank our anonymous donor for sponsoring the program today. Our sponsors help us to pay for liability insurances that nonprofits need to pay for. Also food when we are live. We'll be live again in April, in addition to Zoom, since it's a great platform and allow people who couldn't come to be able to be there virtually. But an anonymous donation allows us to talk about ourselves a little bit more than we normally might. There's the ability to donate on our website at circleoflifecoalition.org, and also look at past programming as well as other topics and articles that we may have placed upon the website. Today, we have with us from the Philly Death Doula Collective, MacDonald and Lori, I'm going to butcher your last name, Zaspel. Lori's professional affiliation is a member of the National End-of-Life Doula Alliance and Association for Death Education and Counseling. Nicki, who could not be here today, is a National Association of Social Workers member and International End-of-Life Doula Association. And Kai is a part of the International End-of-Life Doula Association and National Association of Social Workers. During the presentation, they'll explain what is a death doula and what do they do, when might you want or need one, and death positivity and all its applications. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll go ahead and share my screen if that's everything for the intro. Awesome. Pull that back up to presentation style. So thank you so much. As mentioned, our presentation today will be about death doulas and death positivity, which, based on your intro, you are already operating with a great deal of death positive attitude and approach.
All right. I just want to say we're so happy to be here. I'm glad we've been able to make this happen. We're so grateful that you guys reached out to us. I'm just going to introduce myself and then we'll take the presentation from there. So my name is MacDonald. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a death doula therapist and social worker. My current 9-to-5 position, I'm a social worker and therapist at the Medical Examiner's Office of Philadelphia. I became a trained death doula in 2017 when my mom was sick. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and it kind of, in my anxiety of trying to take care of her, I spent many nights online researching stuff, and I came upon this profession, death doulas, and I fell in love with it. And then in 2019, I helped to co-found the Philly Death Doula Collective with Lori and Nicki. And, a big firm belief of mine is that we all are entitled and deserve a dignified and self-directed death. When I'm not engaged in these roles, I'm a dad to my daughter and a partner to my love. I like to be outside. I like to hike. I like to surf. Yeah. Lori, it's all you.
Hi, I'm Lori. I am a full-time therapist as well as a death doula and lots of other things. I do a lot of educations like this. I make content on the internet about grief and loss and death doula work in general, because so much of what we're doing right now in this field is just educating people that we exist. Among those many different avenues, there's this thread of just, again, as Kai said, just a deep, deep belief that everyone deserves to think about how they want their death to look like, and that death phobia, death anxiety don't really serve us to do that. So without further ado, we'll get into our table of contents and what we're planning to discuss today. So first, we'll talk a little bit about death doulas generally, provide a brief history, and then zoom in a little bit on the ANELDA model. So there is no one way to death doula, but this is the model that we've been trained in, as well as a really good idea to understand the general approach. We'll talk about questions that death doulas might ask that are a little bit different from other practitioners in the end-of-life realm, and answer some of the most frequently asked questions. We'll also always welcome your questions. We'll do a teensy tiny Grief 101, just because we feel like it is absolutely relevant to the next section, which is death positivity. And there are also so many very commonly held misbeliefs and myths around what grieving looks like. Swooping over into death positivity, we'll talk about the history, the tenets, and why it matters. At the end, we'll save a couple of minutes to talk specifically about one part of the ANELDA model and invite you to think about how you might plan your own vigil. So without further ado, we'll head into our first section, which is on the death doula practice and this return to holistic death care, partially as a response to over-medicalization.
All right. So why we're all here? What is a death doula? A death doula is a non-medical support person who assists in the dying process. The term death doula can also be, switched out with death midwives, end-of-life doulas. The word doula comes from the Greek for female helper, but as a non-binary death doula, we know that this isn't just for female-bodied people. But basically, death doulas are trained to provide advice, information, emotional support, and physical comfort to the person who's dying, but also to the family and friends that are a part of the dying process. I think that's something that kind of, sets us apart from a lot of other professions is, we are kind of honed in on the individual that is dying, but their group of people is just as important to us. And something that we do as death doulas is we like to meet our clients and their people where they're at. So we are hospice adjacent, It means that we, I was going to give a percentage. I don't actually have a percentage, but more times than not, we are working with the hospice team to help support the loved ones of the person who's dying. Our role is inherently non-medical. We assist in, we do the emotional support. We also do spiritual support, and something that we love to do is maintain the sacredness of the person who's dying. Next slide.
I also want to add, sometimes death doulas are nurses. Sometimes they are doctors. Sometimes they are massage therapists. Sometimes they are social workers. So sometimes we do overlap, like the little Venn diagram of our skills overlaps with a medical role, but we do try to keep those things separate and distinct. So just a brief history of how this came to pass. And you'll see it's very brief because I'm going from 1865 all the way forward. So in 1865, when President Lincoln was assassinated, the death care industry really changed. The Civil War necessitated a change in the way that we dealt with our dead because so many people died so far away from their loved ones. And how did we bring them back? How did we safely transport those people? That's when a lot of embalming was invented. That's when death care was professionalized and became, rather than a cottage industry or a very local industry or something just your loved ones did for you, it became a job. And thus, at that time, it sort of also became more of a man thing. Gender roles previous to this, it was often women and marginalized people who cared for the dead. And at that time, with professionalization, that changed. In the late 1960s, the birth doula movement began. again, in reaction a bit to that over medicalization of natural processes. You'll notice throughout this presentation, and you've probably already noticed in your life, that entering the world and exiting the world have some parallels. They both have sacred elements. They both have ambiguity. They both have beauty. So birth doulas happened maybe first in terms of official movements, and they created a model very early on that became, again, professionalized and formalized. A little bit later, around 2000, in New York City, they created a volunteer training program where doulas were paired with terminally ill people. They did provide some training for this. Sort of at the same exact time, Baylor University started a 6-week training for doulas. And so all in New York City, there was a lot of borrowing from the birth doula model and reinventing for the differences of death. This is where the ANELDA organization was created. And it was created by a social worker. So ANELDA was formally founded in 2015, but that model, which we'll introduce you shortly, was starting to be developed in 2003. In 2017, the National End of Life Doula Alliance was founded. Their whole idea is to have professional standards and ethics that we all adhere to. That has positives, that has negatives. It's complicated. But I think ultimately NEDA has been an incredibly powerful and positive force in this field. In 2018, more recently, they Death doulas have a special counsel at the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, which again is incredibly important for how do we complement the medical model? How do we support the medical model? Like, we understand that medicine is necessary, important, and good. How do we recognize the places that it doesn't meet people quite where they're at and help support that process? So again, very brief history just to sort of understand how we got to where we are now.
Great. So now we'll go into the ANELDA model. And again, this is the model that we use. The 3 co-founders here, myself, Nicki, Lori, we went through the ANELDA training. So yeah, this is what we use. There's 3 portions to it. The first one is summing up and planning. In this, we're introduced to our client and their people, their family, their friends. In this stage, we address worries or issues related to death, death anxiety, existential angst, anything that kind of comes up in that realm. We explore the life meaning of the person. So, one part of what we do is we listen a lot, and we just let the person who's dying kind of tell us their story, and we reflect back to them what we hear. If they choose to do a legacy project, we start this. We introduce guided visualizations to help, a lot of times there is anxiety with the person that's dying. So we introduce these as a way to kind of, reduce the anxiety and bring some calm to the individual. And also we introduce these to the family and friends that are caring for them, so that, as a death doula, we can't be there 24/7. So we like to, empower and kind of, give information and tools to the people that are going to be there more often. So another thing, I think a lot of what we do in this beginning stage is we educate the person who's dying, but also the friends and family about the dying process, what it looks like, what can happen, what might happen, stages of actively dying. And then also in this stage, we design rituals for later on in the process. The next portion is conducting vigil. And this begins when the person begins to actively die. So what we do here is we are at the bedside as often as possible. Part of why we started the collective was to get a really long list of death doulas in the area, so that when we have clients to work with, we can kind of all help and assist, because we can't be there all the time. Also, this isn't our full-time job yet, so we still have other things to tend to as well. But in conducting vigil, we also provide respite for the loved ones. And again, one thing that we try to do always is maintain sacredness. And then reprocessing and early grief is the next stage. And this begins 3 to 6 weeks after the person has died. And really what it is it's the doula's chance to kind of retell the story of what happened. I was there when my mom was dying, and I don't have a good memory of what happened. I don't remember all the details. I wasn't sleeping well. I was anxious. It was horrible. So I had a death doula, and she came back, about a month later and kind of retold what she saw. And it was really great. We also offer to do a closing ritual. We believe that rituals are a really beautiful way to kind of pause time and, honor the sacredness that has happened. So that's something that we would do there. Next slide, please.
And rituals are actually really good evidence-based practice. Research shows that ritual, whether you believe it has any kind of spiritual power, still returns individuals to a feeling of control and self-efficacy. And when someone we love is dying, control is something that is scarce. A feeling of control is something that is scarce. So ritual can help us feel a little bit more grounded.
Yeah. Thank you, Lori.
Can you tell me a ritual?
Yeah, we love some rituals. So the next slide, death doulas ask questions that other providers may not have time to ask or may not think to ask. Something that we are trained to do is to support the internal landscape of the person dying and support them in grappling with all of the kind of big existential metaphysical things that come up. So we're going to ask them things like, are you worried about any regrets or unfinished business? Is that something you might want to talk about or process? As you think about the days ahead, what worries or concerns you? What are you worried about? What functions are you worried about losing? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about, if you stop talking, how do you want your people to care for you? Can we get in bed with you? Can we comfort you? How do you want us to comfort you? Tell me about how you want to be remembered and why it's important to you. I've never heard doctors ask these questions. I've rarely heard nurses ask these questions. It's something that we are trained to do because that internal landscape is something that we are interested in. I think next slide, Lori. That's you.
From a very practical standpoint, doulas can help present less desirable outcomes. So I have worked in end-of-life care in a couple of different settings at this point, and there are a lot of situations where I thought, oh, if there was just like a doula, we could have avoided that last-minute hospitalization, when all that happened was their person got put in in an ambulance and in a hospital, and they died there instead of at home where they had said they wanted to die. There were no interventions to be done. There was nothing to do, but again, that feeling of a lack of control and that feeling of panic and concern led to them doing the only thing they knew to do, which was to call 911. Hospice can also help with that, but it's an extra layer, right? Another issue that has come up for me time and time again is missing their loved one's last breaths. Yes, that happens sometimes even with a doula, but having someone around who knows your person, who knows the signs and symptoms of end of life, and who can say, hey, I think we're near the end, doesn't mean we're always right, but we can be another source of information. And to fill the gaps, right? Hospice is amazing. Love hospice. Absolutely think it's amazing and incredible. But Nicki, who's unfortunately not here, was a hospice social worker for many years. And she often had 45 plus people on her caseload. How much time can someone with that many individuals to care for spend at a bedside, spend alongside? There are always going to be gaps, right? And though none of us want those gaps, this is one way we can help to fill them.
All right. Some frequently asked questions. So like Lori was just saying, what about hospice? What about them? Oftentimes we work alongside them. Death doulas are not meant to replace hospice, but like Lori was just saying, oftentimes, I work part-time. I'm kind of on call for hospice, and those people, the social workers in this hospice, they have between 40 and 50 patients. So there's not always a lot of time. When my mom was on hospice, she was on hospice for 24 days, I think. We saw the social worker twice and she called once. And this isn't, I'm not saying anything's wrong with hospice, but the idea is that if we're hired or kind of brought on, we can just add another layer of support to hospice. Next questions that get asked often, when do I call a doula? The truth is, the sooner you call us, the better. If we're brought in earlier, we're going to get to know the person better. We're going to be able to, build that stable foundation, that rapport of trust with the person who's dying and also the loved ones and family members. But, if you call us and bring us in, that's going to be good. Next slide. All right. How much does the service cost and who pays? So as of right now, death doulas are not covered by insurance companies. They're covered, a lot of it is out of pocket. We operate on a sliding scale in the Philly Death Doula Collective as a way to, if people are able to pay the higher end, then maybe we can take somebody on at the lower end. Because as a collective, we believe that everybody deserves death doulas, even if, they can't afford it. Capitalistic America today prevents a lot of people from accessing this service, which is for everybody. Every human should get it. But what you're looking at is doula services are not billable through insurance. So the average cost of the family is between $1,500 and $4,000, depending on the number of services provided and the number of hours worked.
And we have taken clients also at the $0 pay rate. So that is something that absolutely can happen. Sometimes, as I mentioned in the history portion, sometimes a doula is associated with a hospice. We are collaborating with hospices to kind of figure out, like, could doulas be a paid part of a hospice team? And I see Deborah's question where, do you collaborate with social work or the other care team members in a hospice? Sometimes. It depends how open they are to that. It also depends what the family and the individual wants. So I worked with an individual in New Jersey who was utilizing medical aid in dying, and he just refused to get a hospice. He had been referred, he had them come out, and he just was like, no, I'm more comfortable with you and my medical aid in dying physician. And so that's how he did it. He didn't want us to collaborate with them, but we absolutely can, will, would love to. I just saw that and felt it kind of fit in right there. So I thought I'd address those questions. And then Dan, I believe we answered your question a little bit about fee for service, but essentially it depends what you want and what you need. I've worked on an hourly basis where I would bill the family weekly, but this is a collaboration. So where do death doulas practice? Frankly, we'll go wherever you are. Yes, that has changed quite a bit with COVID. It used to be that death doulas could go into nursing facilities, skilled nursing facilities. That is starting to become an option again, but for a while there, it really wasn't, was it? So wherever we are welcome is where we will go. I already mentioned this, but absolutely, yes, we will assist medical aid in dying patients as well. We are blessed, I feel, to be so close to New Jersey, where patients in Cherry Hill and other areas of South Jersey can contract our services to accompany those deaths. And then this is a question I got at a presentation once that I thought was just such a good question. I included it, even though it's only been asked once. How do you advocate for clients once they've lost consciousness? That just, at the time, I was like, oh, wow, yeah, how do I? That's why that summing up phase is so important, right? If we don't always get to meet an individual. Sometimes we're serving the family. In that case, we try to explore that individual's values through the family that can speak. And we have to trust that they had enough conversations to understand their values. But we are facilitators, right? The three of us happen to be social workers as well, but all death doulas are trained in facilitation and empathetic listening. And we use those skills to try to center the person who should be at the center of this, the dying individual. And yes, Deborah, your second question, we have absolutely seen an increase in video visits. The hospices, they have been going out all of COVID. in person, but we do a lot more video visits, which I think is wonderful. The individual I mentioned before, because, New Jersey his house was about 40 minutes away from mine. It was really nice to supplement while he was still able with those video visits. Oh, and this is me too, sorry. And this was another question, Dominic, thank you for that. There is no one governing body. There is no one National Association of Social Workers. There is no one state by state organization that you go to say, hey, I'm a death doula, let me take your test and pay your fee and be certified. There are many, many trainings, and there will likely only be more and more. They can cost anywhere. The lowest cost that I'm aware of without scholarship, without sliding scale, is about $750 to $850 now. I think it may have gone up a little bit. And they can range anywhere from just a whirlwind 24-hour weekend to several months of processing, webinar, etc. And they vary in what they teach, right? It depends on the teacher. It depends on the goal of the organizations. I can only teach what I know. So if I were to offer a training, it would be really based in a much more social worky approach, because that's what I know. That's how I practice. And so they're all a little different. Our advice to individuals is to really identify any areas of learning that they need or want to lean into, to take a really honest self-assessment of what skills they already have and can apply and what skills they need, and to find a training that most matches up with that. There are a lot of good trainings. I would like to take them all, and then I could tell you, but to be completely frank, we've only taken the one. So that leads naturally to another question, right? How do you find a good doula? And our general advice with that is to check anelda.org, to check nidaalliance.org, and to check references. So,
All right.
Are there any other questions about death doulas before we move along to this next mini section?
No, and we'll have time for more questions, hopefully at the end. So
Awesome.
Thank you so much for doing it as you go along.
We will keep going.
All right. So next we're doing grief. Grief. These are some common grief myths, and I can only laugh at these. I'm just going to state some of them. Grief has a set endpoint. No, it doesn't. Once grief ends, life returns to normal. That's a lie. Women grieve more than people of other genders. That's a lie. The first year is the worst. It can be. I would say the first 16 months of my grieving of my mom was the worst, but that's not for everybody. Time heals all wounds. That's not true. There is a predictable timeline or order to the grief process. A lot of people reference the 5 stages by Kubler-Ross and Kessler, but they were developed studying people who were dying and were never intended to indicate the order of emotions. So a lot of people are like, oh, I'm in this stage of the blah, blah, blah. But that's, it wasn't about grief. It was about the dying people. You can only grieve a death. That's not true. We grieve all types of things. We grieve breakups. We grieve, loss in bodily function. We grieve so many things. Grief follows a similar path for everyone, especially if they've experienced the same loss. Like anybody who's lost their mother will have the same grief. That's not true. That's a lie.
And that one gets so complicated too, right? Because sometimes siblings expect, because they both lost their mother, they lost the same person, they expect their grief to look the same. And it rarely does, because we knew 2 different versions of that person. We had 2 unique relationships.
Yeah.
So we share these because they're very, very common, as it says, and they can be extremely harmful to the grief process. So we've said what theory we don't like. What theories do we like? What theories do we find helpful? The dual process model, essentially, I didn't put the little Venn diagram here, but essentially this model says that there are two general processes, dual, loss-oriented and restoration-oriented coping. When we are in loss-oriented coping, we are crying, actively mourning, we are grieving, we are looking at pictures, we are doing things which we think of as grieving. But the restoration activities are just as important and just as normal. And it's also very normal to vacillate between the two, sometimes very suddenly. You may be grocery shopping and overwhelmed by grief. And this model normalizes that process. Another approach that we really, really love is companioning. And you can do this for yourself, but it's especially powerful to do for other people in your life. Tenets include being present, not fixing. Grief is not able to be fixed. I'm so sorry. You can integrate it. You can learn to live with it. You can honor it and value it, but it's not to be fixed. It's a completely normal reaction to loss. Listening with the heart rather than analyzing with the mind. So hard to do, so easy to say. Bearing witness, walking alongside, not leading or being led. These are tenets that we can use every single day with the people in our lives who are grieving. And that, if you think about it, it sort of absolves us from having to fix anything. We just get to be present. And honestly, most people, when they can internalize that and practice that, find it to be really freeing. Yeah. Another theory that we very much love is a theory of continued bonds. So there was a time when grievers, and this, you still hear it, but there was a time even when professionals practiced that grievers had to move on from their grief. They needed to not have as many pictures around their house. Talking to their person was a little bit demonized. And it turns out that's all very normal behavior. Continued Bonds acknowledges that grief is ongoing and lifelong. It's extremely normal and actually can be helpful and adaptive to stay in contact with our dead loved ones. It describes grief-related behaviors in a way that normalizes them instead of demonizing them or pathologizing them. And it gives grievers the permission to continue to be in relationship with their loved one.
Death positivity, what it is.
Yeah, so you all seem to have a pretty good grasp on this, actually, but we'll talk a little bit more about it, how it's been formalized and defined thus far.
All right. I'm going to skim over this, the history of death positivity. Death positive movement. In 1974, the first hospice was opened in the United States, and we were inspired by the movement in the UK. In 1976, legislation was passed. It was called the Natural Death Movement and the Natural Death Act, and it gave individuals in America the right to refuse medical treatments. Woohoo! And outside of, from this legislation, the ideas or the things, living will and advanced care directives were born. So it was really starting to give power back to the individuals to, create the death or the end of life that they wanted. In the 1980s, palliative care was introduced more widely, and there was a push to shift from denial of death to enhanced care and quality of life. The 1990s, there was the green burial movement and home funeral movement. 2011, it was the first death cafe model. It was created in London. There was also the natural organic reduction, which is also known as human composting, that was introduced. And then later on, I'm not actually sure if this was 2000. Lori, was this 2011, the death doulas? I mean, I guess it was around there. The stuff in New York was happening, I feel like, yeah. So like around 2011, 2012, death doulas were just becoming more popular and professionalized. And then Caitlin Doherty, which is the founder of the Order of the Good Death, coined the term death positivity. There's a tweet from over to the left that says, why are there a zillion websites and references to being sex positive and nothing for being death positive? So this was really the beginning of this movement, kind of, creating that term and sending it out into the world. And you guys are already doing it so much with your organization. It's very inspiring.
So
Lori's next.
where does this come from? So this gentleman, Ernest Becker, wrote a book, The Denial of Death, and had this theory that all human civilization, everything we do is just this elaborate defense mechanism against knowledge of our own mortality. Let that sink in for a second. Everything we do. The reason I'm here today giving you this presentation is because I'm terrified that I will die and be forgotten. Okay, yeah, that feels right for me. You can evaluate for yourself how right it feels for you. But basically, he argued that our motivation for good things, bad things, all things, if we really boil it down, if we really go way down deep and past all our defenses, is our need to control our anxiety. And those immortality projects, this presentation, all of the other things, our kids, the things we try to do to pass along parts of ourselves to the rest of the world, is something that we do so that it can outlast us. It can be our legacy. See how this all connects. And it reinforces our belief that our lives have meaning and purpose and significance. This is all very much related to terror management theory, which is another thing I can talk about for a very long time, but I will save you. And that's a different presentation. But it again all relates to that management of death anxiety. And so one way we can manage anxiety is not by avoiding it. Right? If we over rely on avoidance, it does not help our anxiety. So we're going to use that approach with death.
All right, the tenets of death positivity. I will not bore you and read you every single one of these. I'm just going to read, I'll read one or two, and then Lori will read one, and we'll just give a little example. These are on the Order of the Good Death website, if you guys want to access them and read through them. Number 2, I believe that the culture of silence around death should be broken through discussions, gatherings, art, innovation, and scholarship, just like what we're doing here. We are already death positive. Next slide. And then number 4, I believe that the dead body is not dangerous and that everyone should be empowered, should they wish to be involved in care for their own dead. I think I shared a little bit before, one thing that got me into this work is my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and she was given 10 to 11 months to live. And I was thrown into this state of like, oh my God, how do I help my favorite person in all the worlds have the death that she wanted? And I started researching things, and I came across being a death doula, and I learned all of these things that were the opposite of what society taught me. I thought that we had to get the body out of the house immediately. I didn't think we had time to kind of, be with our loved ones after they die, and that's not true. My mom died at 7:13, and she wasn't taken out of the house until almost 2 a.m. We washed her body, we sang with her, we wrapped her in her favorite color, we covered her in flowers, we lit the whole room with candles, we took pictures, we laughed, we cried, we got in bed with her, and all of this stuff I wouldn't have known if I wasn't, on the path of being a death doula and wasn't on the path of death positivity. So thank goodness for education. Lori, your turn.
So the one I'll choose to highlight here is that I believe my open, honest advocacy around death can make a difference and change culture. Again, it's literally why I'm here. It's why I'm so passionate about learning as much as I can so that I can share as much as I can. At the beginning of this presentation, we shared, fancy degree stuff and letters after our names. And while I would never say that education doesn't matter, I would like to share that as openly and widely as possible so that as many people as possible can benefit from it. This type of information should not only be available to those of us who can afford $100,000 in graduate school loans. It should be widely available to everyone. And this is part of equity and equality. And I will keep on doing it. So why does this matter? Well, I just talked a little bit about why it matters to me, but death and grief are universal experiences. Every single one of us on this earth who is currently living will experience a death of our own, and we will likely experience a grief. We've probably already have many times. And so when we open ourselves to that truth, we invite the opportunity to have an authentic end of life, something that resonates with who we are and reflects the way we lived. We've already talked about some of the negative outcomes of death avoidance, but a few more are having no advanced care directives, which is the nullification of self-determination, futile and painful interventions at the end of life, ineffectual pain management, therapeutic rupture, and truncated or complicated grief. I cannot tell you how much education I do with my clients about processing a loss that they misunderstood what happened. And they are blaming themselves for something that was a completely natural part of the dying process.
Yeah.
Let's get personal.
Fun stuff. All right. So this is something we would, just referencing the Inelda model again, we would activate the vigil plan when the person starts to actively die, but we would create and dream up the plan in the summing in the first process. And what are the elements of a vigil plan? So we think about the space, the desired place of the death. Is it going to be, can it be at home? What room is it going to be in? The position of the bed, placement of special objects, and how the space looks. I always go back to my mom's death because that's the thing that's, in my head and heart. My mom wanted to be facing the window. She wanted, I'll share more of this after I do a couple more because I didn't want to tell too much ahead of time. So the next things that we're thinking about are the atmosphere, smells, sounds. What does the room feel like as far as lighting, incorporation of nature, spirituality, windows open, windows closed. Now I can share. My mom wanted to be facing a window. She wanted the ocean waves. I have a sound machine. She wanted the ocean waves. She didn't want, she wanted candles lit everywhere. She didn't want actual, electric lights to be on. She just wanted candles. She wanted us to read to her. She had a book of her favorite poetry. She wanted, we created this is actually really fun. We created a playlist on Spotify of all the music that she wanted to play kind of in this final stage. A next element of the visual planning is interactions, tone and tenor of conversations. How loud do you want things to be? A lot of times people lose the ability to speak kind of closer to death. So these are things that we have to have conversations about prior to that point. We utilize guided imagery at this point and elements of ritual and then ongoing legacy work. And then the other, just kind of other things that we always make sure that we talk about and think about before active dying actually happens is, medication, physical care. Can people get in bed with you? How do you want us to bathe you? Who can see you naked? Who can't see you naked? Who can, be a part of your physical body while this is happening? Who is it that you trust? We have all these conversations. And then, will the body be washed? Will there be a home funeral? So these are all things that we are talking about in the first stage, but then implementing once the body starts to actively die. Lori, did you want to add anything? Oh, well, I guess this is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we encourage you to think about your vigil plan now. How would you answer some of these questions? Always, we have to come up with a plan B, C, and D, right? Sorry. My husband's getting a whole bunch of notifications. Apologies. Where do you want to die? Why? Okay, even just starting there, we might need a plan B, right? There are sometimes good reasons why we cannot die in our chosen atmosphere or chosen location. If we are in a hospice and that's not what you wanted, how can we make it as close to what you wanted as possible? That might mean LED candles, right? Like if Kai's mama had not been able to be at home, and I know for sure you'd have made that happen, buddy. Like,
Yeah.
how do we make it as close to what you want as possible? What people and animals are important to be there? How or will you introduce a sense of the sacred? Do you want people to talk to you? Do you want people to read to you? What music or sounds do you want to hear? So I had a client who we had talked quite a lot about one particular author. And so I brought one of her books to read while we waited for him to pass, just because I thought he hadn't mentioned that, but because we talked so much about it, he said he didn't care. That's what his whole vigil plan was. I don't care. And that's okay, right? Like, so then your doula can kind of step in, your loved ones can kind of step in to say, well, how would I like to honor them? In my case, I want a stack of books. Anybody who doesn't know what to say, they just pick some from one of those books that I've pre-chosen, read a little bit about it, read a little bit from it. It's really as unique as each individual is. So here's our resource list. I believe we can provide a PDF of this if we haven't already, and then you can refer to any part of this. I know we have some other questions that popped up already. I saw them. I think the grief association with suicide particularly challenging? Absolutely. When an individual completes suicide, it's often stigmatized. It's often grieving is more complicated in certain ways. And luckily, there are lots of supports for individuals who are experiencing that sort of loss. So there are specific grief support groups, as well as organizations that specifically support that type of loss. They're easily found from a quick Google, but I actually don't have a ton of experience with that loss. So I'll defer to Kai. I think you may actually have more.
With suicide?
Do you not work with that group with the
Yeah.
examiner's office?
At the medical examiner's office, I actually don't work with it. I work with natural deaths. So I'm dealing with, people that die in their home. That's another social worker. So I can't really speak on it either. But it's true, there are a lot of online resources and groups that gear just towards that type of loss.
It's a common enough experience that there's a specialization. So we don't want to talk out of the side of our mouths. The other question is, what is your experience with medical aid in dying and associated grief response of family members? At this time, I've only assisted one medical aid in dying death. However, those family members have had a very well supported and healthy grief process, from my understanding. I'm still in touch with them. We were able to refer them to counseling early on so that they would have that support in an ongoing way. And they've done incredibly well. All the members of the family were able to get on board with his decision, and it was just an incredibly powerful and beautiful experience. I'm also in touch with another death doula who does these assists these deaths very frequently, and she has found similarly that it actually is incredibly empowering, dignified, and they're able to find the beauty in it in their grief process.
Yeah.
Do we offer mentoring? No.
We don't have time. Maybe when this becomes our full-time job, I think we'll consult, offer mentoring, but
there are doulas who have chosen to specialize in that area or make it a part of their practice, and it is not currently a part of practice that we would like to focus on. We do have resources on our website because we get that question so often with our general advice and where to find mentoring. But again, it's just not what we've chosen to focus on currently. The PowerPoint, we'll make it available as a PDF, yes. And then have you included art making in your practices?
Yeah, I feel like I've utilized art in exploring a individual's life meaning. I also feel like I've utilized art in reference to creating a legacy project with clients. I think that art is a beautiful thing to incorporate in if there's time and if the individual and family want to, process things through art. Yeah, it's always an option.
Same. The individual I mentioned earlier was a writer and had wanted to write, his memoirs. And so we did do a lot of co-writing together. I'm an extremely fast typist. So part of my role was just to write verbatim his stories, as many of them as we could get. And those have been shared with his family as a legacy project. Yes, thank you, Deborah. There's tons of mentorship out there. It is available.
Yep.
Did we get to all of the questions? I think so. So I'm hoping we'll be able to launch the poll. Tom, if you're still on, if you could launch it, it won't let me because you're still logged in. But certainly you can offer any further questions through our website, circleoflifecoalition.org, and we will make sure that they get to our fabulous presenters. Thank you so much for presenting. Most definitely. This was so fascinating. And you're right, it goes with our mission for educating the community. And since doulas are not readily available in our Berks County, if we could continue to keep our things muted, that'd be great. But in our Berks County community, you certainly can create your own vigil plan, or what your family likes and wants and so forth. You absolutely can do that. And I think we probably, speaking for my family, have some traditions to pull upon. But what doulas can do, or someone that you designate as a person to help you with that, it's hard to do when you're in the midst of it. It's hard to think of everything. So having a little checklist on standby, or having somebody who also knows your family can help and suggest things that your mom, dad, sister, brother, loved one, husband, wife might like at the end of life. Yeah, there's a comment here that I just saw. Thank you for this. It's a great partnering aspect for ministers to their dying congregation members. Absolutely.
Yes, the training that Nicki and I attended, this is pre-COVID, so it was in person in Boston. There were quite a few spiritual leaders there from many different spiritual practices. Who that was their whole plan. They were like, I just want to do this for people in my group because I've noticed a need. And so they wanted to add a skill to their already considerable repertoire. And frankly, that's sort of why I got to this, right? Like I got this training as a social worker, master's level social worker. And then it's like, okay, there's still some holes here that I would like to fill and have more understanding. So that we can just serve people better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fabulous. I hope in the future that partnering with the National Hospice, Association will help make some standards. Because sometimes when there's lots of trainings out there, it gets a little crazy, for lack of a better word. That's coming to my mind right now, but it does need to be more structured and standardized so that there aren't some practices that occur that are not acceptable, and then give folks a bad name. So we certainly don't want to do that. And then lots of people, writing great presentation, and it is a really, really wonderful presentation. I'm glad you're able to do it. A reminder to everyone that this is being recorded and will be available on our website in the next week or so for sure. So any type of slides that you want to look at again, or have your families look at, or anyone else that you wish to look at, have a look at this and listen is wonderful. I think the resources on grief are so important during this time of still some recovery, even though things have loosened up, not being able to keep a vigil with your loved one during the height of the pandemic before vaccines was tough on folks. So those grief resources are certainly very beneficial.
Yes, and for there's often a dearth of supports for people midlife, I find, like anywhere from, if you're not a child and you're not an elder, there can be a little bit of a middle zone where there's not really a group for you. And for COVID related griefs, the COVID Grief Network I've worked with them. I was a volunteer with them. They're offering really amazing groups that are free, international. I worked with an individual in Ireland. I had in my group someone from Poland. Like, it was an incredible opportunity to commune in COVID related grief for individuals in their 20s and 30s who are often just expected to like move along. I mean, we all are, but I think especially at that point in your life, they're like, you're resilient. And like, okay, cool. Yeah. But I'd also like some support.
I have 60 plus more years, hopefully, to live in this life. So let me do that healthily. Definitely. Not me, 20 somethings.
Also not me. Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, most definitely. If there are no more questions, we're going to just wrap things up. Hopefully the poll launched. If not, again, circleoflifecoalition.org. Oh, Gary's nodding. The poll launched. Yay. Go ahead, please fill that out. We take your opinions very seriously. And again, definitely would love any suggestions for future topics. Next month in April, I have to go look at my note here because I don't have it memorized. We have Living the Present Moment with Sister Jean Jacobczyk. So great with names. And our sponsor will be Zaspel. So definitely looking forward to seeing many of you at that presentation. Am I forgetting anything, members of the board who are on here? Sister Gary, Dom, chime in. Okay. Again, thank you for being here, and thank you to our fabulous speakers. And it was really A+ presentation. Everybody have a fabulous day.